Sports Professor Rick Horrow inside the $1.3 trillion business of sports. You're on the record. Contemporary issues of the day. I'm live in Auckland, New Zealand. About 2 million people or so in this urban area. An incredible mix of urban, Maori, British culture, Polynesian. The whole country is a little over 5 million people, and they love their sports. They love their sports of all kind. Rugby, the big deal here. Obviously, U.S. Football. And one of the things that we're going to talk about today is the international implication of issues that are trying to improve sports on all aspects of the games. Rachel Grashow, the Director of Epidemiological Research Initiatives and co-investigator of Family Experience Managing Football Lives, the Football Players Health Study at Harvard. It's funded by the Players Association, but it seems to be rising across the political spectrums as a study that matters and carries great weight. She has a Master's of Science in Epidemiology at the Harvard Chan School. Her work's focused on how environmental exposures affect the overall and cognitive health of uniquely vulnerable populations, children, pregnant women, and elderly veterans, and, not surprisingly, obviously, professional athletes. The study took some additional impact amid the Tua controversy week 2 of last year, saw Rachel at a Lee Steinberg Super Bowl event, and obviously important findings for her because hers is not just significant about CTE and what happens. Her survey, 1,900 respondents, 681 said they believe they suffer from CTE. Over 230 say they've experienced suicidal thoughts. An additional 176 reported a formal diagnosis of Alzheimer's. And this study is all about changing habits. It's not necessarily changing blocking patterns and what happens around the NFL. Clearly important in all sports, Pop Warner, field hockey, soccer, every level. But it's also important because of the cultural and societal impacts of this finding as it impacts all kinds of sports. So for Rachel Grashow, a very significant study. Let's hear more from her before we get into the normal opening bell and 5 to watch. Sports Professor Rick Horrow inside the $1.3 trillion business of sports. We're on the record with an incredibly important concept, with an incredibly important academically oriented approach, and person who has been at the forefront of the tough issues of CTE, concussions, and what is the primary focus now, a primary focus for a long time, clearly will continue to be. Rachel Grashow, the Director of Epidemiological Research Initiatives and co-investigator of Family Experiences Managing Football Lives for Football Players Health Study at Harvard. She's also a research scientist at Harvard's T.H. Chan School of Public Health, earned a bachelor's at Wesleyan, PhD at Brandeis, computational neuroscience. I'm a lawyer, I can't even pronounce it. As a Master of Science at Epidemiology at the Harvard Chan School, focusing on how environmental exposures affect the overall and cognitive health of uniquely vulnerable populations. This, I guess you would argue, is uniquely vulnerable population.
I would, yeah.
How are you?
I'm doing great. It's really great to be here. Thank you, Rick.
Thank you. You appreciate it. We were first introduced at the Lee Steinberg event when you were a very important panelist for brain health, and everybody's focusing on brain health. Your study that was driven by the players, but a firewall, you'll explain that in a minute, included 1,980 respondents. You'll talk about the conclusions of it. Talk about the study for a minute.
Sure. And I asked a pointed question. I was not on the panel, but I was very grateful to be there because it was a great discussion. So I work for the Football Players Health Study, which is the largest study of former professional football players. We have about 5,000 former players who have joined us. And because we're the largest study, we feel like we're the authority on the living player experience. A lot of the studies that are out there now look at deceased players or players at the end of their lives, and we really look at players who are living both right after their career all the way into their 90s to see how they're faring and how their football experiences and their life decisions impact their health now.
And The study was conducted by Harvard, but published the Journal American Medical Association Neurology. The methodology, very important. Clearly, that's the driving piece of this, but paid for by the players, hopefully accepted by everybody. Tell me how you protect neutrality.
Sure. So we are funded by the NFL Players Association. That's where we get all of our funding. No funding from the NFL, but we always want to be really clear that there's a firewall, both ethical and legally, between us and the NFLPA. So while they fund the work, they cannot tell us what to study, who to study, how to publish it, and we give no data back to the NFLPA. And we also give no data in exchange, no funding with the NFL. So I feel like we're very protected and can stand from a scientifically neutral place with experts from the medical school, from the School of Public Health, from the local hospitals and other authorities to conduct our research.
Talk about the specific findings of those 1,980 respondents.
So specifically for the paper you're referring to, I just want to, we were looking at beliefs about CTE. So just to remind your listeners that CTE as of yet cannot be diagnosed in a living player. And in some ways, because we only work with living players, you would think that the CTE question really isn't under our jurisdiction. But what we're finding is that despite the fact that you can't ever know if you actually have it as a living player, players are being told that they have it by their physicians, and they're even very concerned about it. So what we wanted to ask was, how many of our cohort think that they have CTE? And what we found was that 1 in 3 thought that they did. And really importantly, we found that it wasn't random. The guys who thought they had CTE actually had a lot of conditions that caused cognitive problems. They were more likely to have things like sleep apnea, things like high blood pressure, to be depressed. So there's a whole series of conditions that players suffer from that actually affect your brain without a single head injury, like sleep apnea. And what we think is happening is that the players who are having cognitive issues are getting triggered. They can't find their keys. They're assuming that they have CTE, even though they can't actually know that. And we looked further, and what we found was that guys who thought they had the CTE were about 5 times more likely to be suicidal than the players who did not think they had CTE. So even though we can't know for sure whether they have it, we more cared about who was worried about this and how were they handling that worry. And I think that it was a really important finding, certainly for living players, their families, and their doctors.
Well, it's an important finding because when you do the traditional analysis of what a lot of these studies do, it is a kind of a post-death. Here is what CTE happened. Here's how it happened. And do we think it's too violent of a game? And how do you change tackles and all this? This is a behavioral study in many ways. And part of it is something that will be a very important set of facts as we move ahead, right?
Absolutely. And I think the key is we want to look under the light of the lamppost while we're waiting for CTE researchers to figure out how to know who has it when they're alive, and even more importantly, how to treat it. What we can do is go after these conditions like sleep apnea, like depression, like high blood pressure, that we know are hurting the players' brains. And so we should protect what we can protect now while they're alive. And so that's why it was helpful.
Of the 230 that said they experienced suicidal thoughts, according to the article, an additional 176 reported the formal diagnosis of Alzheimer's or different forms of dementia. That's a formal reporting, or is that a kind of a belief they have it?
Well, we asked them if they'd been told that they had dementia or CTE or any of these conditions. So it's all self-reported. We didn't have, say, medical records in front of us. But again, I think we're dealing with perceptions at the moment, and we were more concerned with what was on their plate and how is that affecting their understanding of their health. And so that was a piece of that.
So this was released and done, certainly released, in the middle of the Tua week 2. Is he going to retire? Is he not going to retire? And so did it add to the interest as it was revealed? How did this whole Tua issue help or hurt the transmission and acceptance of the findings?
In large ways, it didn't really affect it. Again, we try to stay, because we only study former players, we tend to not be as influenced by the experiences of active players. and the more acute effects of head injury. So I don't think it changed much. I think we are alarmed by the suicidality and the overall anxiety that we're seeing in players and the undertreatment of things that we know that are affecting their health. So I would say that it didn't really affect our work or change our focus. People may have paid attention in a different way, but really trying to speak to the former players is where our research is most relevant.
Yeah, and one of the big issues as a lawyer, sometimes it's dangerous about departing from facts, and that's why this is a very important interview for me and all the publications that we're going to do. Then we got Will Smith's concussion film about 10 years ago that dramatized. I don't know if it dramatized good because everybody was aware of it, or dramatized bad because there's a lot of drama attached to Hollywood. What's your take on that piece of it? And then we'll go to the next one.
Well, I haven't seen the film, so I don't think that
okay.
I don't think I can speak to it, but I want people, in some ways, what I wish is that the media, and I appreciate this is what you're doing, is to be thoughtful and measured. Again, a lot of the science that's out about football players is anecdotal, or it comes from tiny studies of 20 or 30 players. And what we're trying to do is sort of shift the focus and change the narrative to what have we learned from living players, 5,000 of them. And honestly, what we're finding in the 5,000 is often a bit different from what's found in the smaller studies. So we want everyone to weigh all of the evidence and to think about that piece before they jump to a CTE conclusion. I think that I think one of the things I said when we met was that people don't realize that 65% of former players pass away of cardiovascular disease, and 14% pass away from neurodegenerative. And while I don't want to take attention away from neurodegenerative disease, I also want to shift the focus to the fact that cardiovascular disease is the biggest challenge for former players. And those things are treatable with medication and lifestyle changes and diet. And so again, we kind of want to add to the narrative and broaden it about player health and not get so focused that we ignore other dangers for former players.
That is so incredibly important as well. And I assume that message is being accepted, not just because it comes from you in the quote concussion box, but there are a lot of other people in the general health box that are advocating a similar message.
I certainly hope so. I think it's been hard to adopt in some ways the cardiovascular piece of the story for a number of reasons. I think it's in some ways, I don't know how sexy it is to talk on the news about hypertension, but hypertension is such a massive danger for these players. And we think that, we don't know for sure yet, but the hypothesis is that having untreated hypertension for many years, that we're even seeing in players right after they leave the league, having that not treated plus head injury may together sort of synergize in a way that impacts the brain later. And again, how do we go after what's treatable while we figure the other pieces out as scientists and doctors?
Yeah, it makes too much sense. Hopefully people will listen to this even more. Pop Warner, youth football, all of those issues. The polling is mixed with parents saying, I'm not going to do it. I'm only going to do it with these certain leagues that guarantee contact safety, water break safety, all of the kinds of things that are important. Some will say, if you don't do flag, forget it. The opinions are mixed there. You have an interesting concept about size of study and where we're going with it, but give me your take as it relates to kids.
Well, I think a lot of the studies that came out that looked at the age of first football exposure and they made a cutoff at 12, those findings are actually based on, I think, about 20 to 30 players that were recruited who were very ill. And so I more want to encourage people to look at bigger studies. We tried to replicate those results in our 4,000 strong cohort, and we saw something different. We didn't see that starting before or after age 12 was a big determinant of later health. Now, there are absolutely other determinants. And what we want to say is not that playing football and head injury as a child is safe. What we really want to do is point to what does matter. Is it the type of football you played? Is it the position? Is it orthopedic injury that causes pain and opioid addiction? If we can sort of use our big data set to say what does matter, then I think we have the chance to really intervene for young men and give them the chance to be a part of this incredible team and self-esteem building experience and also preserve their health. But we just want to really rely on more people from a varied group before we make policy decisions necessarily, again, based on 20 to 30 players. And so that's really where we're pushing people just to be data-driven about it while we pick up answers. Yeah.
Yeah. And so speaking of more people in a larger database, how much of the study is applicable to the ongoing controversy of kids heading in soccer, kids playing in front of a goal in lacrosse, kids boxing, for example, certainly ultimate fighting, all of the brain-related contact sports that are not football.
Well, I will say that we are played by the NFL, the National Football League Players Association. So we don't get funding, say, from the NHL or other groups to study other sports, and I would love to.
Yeah.
So while I can't speak broadly, what I'll say is that we've taken what we've learned from football players and head injury and how that seems to cause high blood pressure and depression and low testosterone, and say that when we look at that in patients, because we use the work from our players to guide normal patients with a single head injury, we see the same thing. We see that a head injury leads you to hypertension earlier, to low testosterone earlier, to depression, all these things earlier. And so to the extent that I think it's true in a patient with a single head injury, and we see it in our players with many, my assumption, my hypothesis really would be that for lacrosse, for soccer, for hockey, we would probably see something similar. But we won't know until we have the data. And I would love to look into that if I could.
Are there studies that are being done that are remotely similar to what you're doing, funded by those other organizations?
Not at the moment. Again, the studies are still relatively small. And so I think we would love to partner with an organization who wanted to look at those things, because I think we've got a great machinery to do so. And the question is just how do we reach those athletes and encourage them to participate?
Yeah, everybody out there, you got to be listening, because this is not something that is going to be resolved in the gossip columns or the radio shows that talk about who yells the loudest. This is going to be done in the boardroom and in scientific explanation. We all understand that. To that end, how do you, in your best advice or process, help deliver consensus among disaffected folks? The NFL and NFLPA go through constant negotiations, and this goes from the front burner to the side burner, depending on other economic considerations. So how do we elevate this, and how do we build consensus off it?
Yeah. Well, I will say, one of our strengths is that we use something called the community-based participatory research model, which is a mouthful. But our work is essentially player-driven. The observations they make in their lives playing and after really guide the science. And so to a large degree, I think by working with the community and getting our message straight to them, while sort of media ups and downs and the money that goes back and forth, I think the strength that we have with the trust that we've tried to build, I think, with the players and their families, I think speaking directly to them has allowed us to, I think, weather some of the ups and downs. But to the extent that we can have platforms like these and, go to the events like where I met you to talk directly to players and their families, right? In some ways, their partners become their nutritionist, their physical therapist, their personal therapist, speaking to them too. But I think it's hard because there are ups and downs, and health in football players becomes trendy and then it's not, and trying to just stay really steady and weather those, I think, is our job.
Well, and I would assume that the entire industry has a similar stake in the outcome of this process, and certainly looking at your study. The insurance industry, for example, the owners of all professional sports franchises to keep people healthy, the alumni associations, not necessarily the players. And so there are a lot of interested groups, I assume, that are constituents potentially that ought to look at this and take it seriously.
Absolutely, especially because what we're finding is very actionable. It's like head injury may cause depression, but depression is treatable. Head injury may cause hypertension, and that's treatable. And so as much as people are paying attention, we're just trying to point people towards really safe and efficacious treatments that are out there to protect their long-term health. I think there's a lot that's known. Getting that across to the community and kind of combating the doom and gloom that comes from that CTE narrative has been a massive challenge, because trying to stay, again, data-driven, and use what we know to motivate players, we're fighting a little bit against the tide because of sort of the story that gets told now.
Yeah. And so as to now, let's morph ahead with your huge crystal ball. Where is this industry, this movement, the whole, I know there are methodological advances that are going to be happening in the next 5 years, but kind of give me a broad brush of where, what will you be advocating, and what does the industry look like 5 years from now?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm trying to think. I'm not sure. I think what's happening in some ways, one of the issues with the sort of the CTE research is that I think originally the imaging was going to be really promising. Same thing with Alzheimer's. This idea was there's been this advancement in medical technology. We were going to use it to figure out who has different conditions. And I think what we're looking forward in the future is sort of going to be more of a blended approach of what if imaging is helpful to diagnose living players and to help living players? What biomarkers, blood biomarkers, can we measure to predict how they're doing and get them the treatments they need? To what extent can we leverage, remote technology like cognitive testing online? So I think in some ways what we're moving towards is a precision approach that's personalized for players, but that pulls in data from lots of different ways, personal and on the macro level. And I think that's where we're going. I want to encourage skepticism of new technologies or new treatments or sort of these snake oil salesmen that come into players' lives and try to offer them some newfangled thing. And just to really encourage people to be cautious, because I think there's a lot of money to be made off of the vulnerability of the fear in these families. And so I'm hoping that people learn how to personalize how they handle their health, post-play.
Your encouragement of skepticism is very well deserved and earned, because you are data-driven and the work you're doing is data-driven, and you're in an area where it's always a rush to judgment and some significant controversy, and you're handling it really well. And I'm really proud of you being a fellow Harvard person. And so we're going to get together soon. Rachel Grashow, the core study person for this entire world. You're going to hear a lot more about it in the future. Rick Horrow, sports professor, speak with you soon.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was great to be here.
The 5 to watch here in Auckland, New Zealand. They're relevant all over the world. Number 1, ESPN, a breakup with Major League Baseball. They spend $550 million a year in rights fees. Jimmy Pitaro, a lifelong baseball fan. But the bottom line is that he is going to do much more to try to be fiscally conservative. Baseball in 2024 accounted for about 2.2 million or 2.2% of the overall linear ad spend on ESPN, about $60 million. That's replaceable, is what the folks are telling him. And also, of the $18 billion in revenue generated by the sports union in 2024, affiliate fees kick in about $11 billion, or about 60% of the total, while advertising only about $5 billion. And more important, 42% of the subscribers to the legacy bundle cut the cord. You add all that up, what is the future for Major League Baseball viewers? Well, it's World Cup potentially. It's also more important than that, because on the women's side, WNBA, Stanley Cup, and the College World Series, not baseball. That's number 1. Number 2, the Australian National Rugby League. It's important here, but it's also important in the States. They made about 744 million Australian last year as compared to 701 the year before. The broadcast formats and all across New Zealand here and Australia seem to show the league is in the right direction. Why is that relevant for an American audience? This is the worldwide, however. That's one. And number 2 is the opening of their season opening trip is in Vegas in this weekend at Allegiant Stadium. They expect a very packed facility. Their promoters here say, look, they're losing a bundle, but they're generating worldwide awareness, and everybody here riveted to their television sets looking at this event as the beginning of a season that the Australian and New Zealand rugby enthusiasts live and die for. That's number 2. Number 3, the PGA Tour and PIF have had constructive conversations as deal talks with Trump around include PIF Governor and Adam Scott and Jay Moynihan and Tiger Woods and Rory McIlroy. Bottom line is, for the first time, they're talking about, quote, operating under one tour, which is very important. The Justice Department may have hands off on this. They plan to continue to move forward in discussions. The tour has a policy board meeting this week at the Cognizant in Palm Beach. The rival tours have been sending mixed messages. Scott O'Neill, the new head of the LIV organization, has been just across the water here in Australia touting the benefits of LIV. That may in fact be just because they have the ability to generate leverage before a deal. We're going to have to see. It's number 3. Number 4, Portland Trail Blazers, 69% increase in over-the-top television ratings. That's not as important as the template that's being created. The Sinclair local affiliate, KUNP, has gone to work promoting, sponsoring. The deal includes Blazer Vision DTC platform, only a $3 million business at best. The $20 to $25 million in rights fees hadn't really worked. The Blazers, though, continue to receive about $142 million a year in league television revenues, so they're going to be fine. But the other teams that have tried this model, the Jazz dipping 44%, the Suns dropping 19%. Not sure what the reasons are for that. They haven't had great seasons. But is the model to be believed, or does it tie most exclusively or specifically into team performance? We're going to have to see. But that's number 4. And then number 5, drone crackdown. NCAA, MLB, NASCAR, all leagues are sponsoring or supporting bipartisan legislation introduced by Tom Cotton of Arkansas, Democrat, Republican, and Jackie Rosen, Democrat from Nevada, where venues seating 30,000 or more will have mandatory zone restrictions up to 3,000 feet and all over the footprint of the facility itself. The law enforcement officials have technical authority, but they don't have the feds supporting them with their implementation abilities. This is one of the things that's going to be attempted, and guarantee you, with all of the legislation all over the world, all over Congress, and all the fighting, this one's going to get passed. We can pretty much assure it. So that's the 5 opening bell. Next up, the 5 to watch. The 5 to watch. What's coming up the next couple of weeks? Well, I'm in Auckland for the next week, but you only don't want to hear about me. We're going to play a little bit of golf after these speeches are done. Everybody interested here in the business of sports. And by the way, the 2032 Olympics in Brisbane, the Women's World Cup was a New Zealand-Australia shared event. Olympics too big to pull that off for this next year. Stadiums abound. All Blacks looking for a new home here in Auckland and otherwise. But look at the 5 to watch. They are similar no matter where you are. Number 1, the hockey tournament that just was an incredible event. 9.3 million viewers on ESPN, 8.9 million for the Stanley Cup in 2019. This was the highest watched on ESPN for hockey. But for the Canadian counterparts, Sportsnet 10.7, the second most watched hockey game ever. Gary Bettman says that the Winter Olympics, the team goes for the first time next year since 2014. 2028, the NHL and Player Association-owned World Cup of Hockey returned for the first time since 2016. Then we're going to see a rotation where the normal All-Star game kicks in every couple of years or so, including at the UBS Arena, which will be interesting to see. Bottom line is, he's got a tiger by the tail, going to continue to try to push it, but we've got to wait its turn. All-Star Week, unlike the other leagues, are very positive opportunities for the NHL. That's number 1. Number 2, Atlanta United continues to surge as MLS opens. We'll see what happens in the other facilities around the country. But their opening match, over 65,000. They reduced capacity a bit with some of the sections, could have sold more. That week through Saturday night, 81,000 at Dortmund, 68,000 in Milan. The other 3 were international games. The point is, first time in American soccer history that an American venue had one of the top 5 internationally attended games of the world that week, and it looks like the sky is the limit for the MLS. Watch the USL as their expansion and Division I aspirations continue to move forward, but let's watch it very carefully. That's number 2. Number 3, NASCAR and the Daytona 500. The 3.4 rating and about 6.7 million viewers in viewership, up about 13%. The race at that point was postponed until Monday in previous races, and William Byron wins his second in a row. The least watched Daytona 500 in the past couple of years, but when you realize that the event, when it was raining the last time, finished past midnight, you can't really count it, or at least you can't argue that it's apples to apples. But yet, we'll see how NASCAR starts its season and takes it to the next level. That's number 3. Number 4, Shot Tracker, 50 college programs around the country. Arizona, Arizona State, Utah, Colorado, and others, high tech for men's and women's Big Ten programs. The starting as a major sensor-based technology, you've seen it in golf events, has evolved into an AI-based video and data analytics company, including investors Magic Johnson and the late David Stern. 17 Division I college programs and more on the way. Watch this company. And then number 5, TCL inks the IOC top sponsorship program through 2032. The home audiovisual equipment and appliance Paralympic and Olympic partner. It's a lot to say, but it's going to be a lot of money. The 4 decades-old partnership with Panasonic ended after the Paris Summer Games last year. A founding member of the Global Olympic Partner Program known as TOP. And in 1985, Japanese firms Toyota and Bridgestone also left the Olympic program by not renewing. IOC lost a total of 4 top sponsors last year: Atos, Bridgestone, Panasonic, and Toyota. The addition of TCL puts the program at 12 global sponsors. The important part of this is the Olympics seems to be recovering. A lot of people said these major sponsors are abandoning them. Yeah, maybe one in each category to be ably replaced by others in that category. That is the Olympic movement in a nutshell. Well, those are the 5 to watch this next week. We'd like to thank Callie Kazire for helping us put the program together, and Dr. Rachel Grashow for giving us her incredibly unique expertise on the advances in medical science technology, not just how hard you hit somebody, but also all of the impacts in contact sports, profound implications in the future. We'll be back from Australia next week, New Zealand next week, sorry, a little bit of golf and a little bit of academics. Next week, we will have another significant guest in the world of the $1.3 trillion business of sports. Sports professor Rick Horrow, thanks for listening, thanks for watching. Speak with you soon.